Hey, so yesterday I get a DM from somebody that I message with, a fellow from Australia, and he sends me a podcast, and he's like, blah 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 blah. I'm like, yeah, I don't want to watch this, and he was joking around because he knew he was sending me something antagonizing. I'm glad it wasn't particularly antagonizing to me because I have been baited at times to. I don't do well. Okay, I can look you in the camera and be like, I don't do well. I'm very very okay taking it. I'm very much better dishing it out. I still don't want to read that stuff. I mean, as many people know, years ago, a couple of jerks did over a 3 hour podcast just on me, and that really sucked. So this wasn't about me, but it was stuff that I talk a lot about in terms of what at least has been being very popular, what we're looking at in terms of this anti-glycolytic training. And something that's important is somebody asked me to do something, I think you should do it, if you can do it. So instead of listening to music while I trained, I listened to the podcast. And I was giving him reports every so often as it came through. There's a couple different pieces that this whole little talk here will reference, but really I said, yeah, 15 minutes in, there's nothing, like the podcast host and the researcher, they sounded kind of prickly, but there was nothing that, objectively from a scientific level that was antagonistic. They might use different words, but I didn't think they were doing that. And I'll get into what some of those topics are because I think that's important for one of those spaces. What are they saying? And, is it true or not true, at least to my understanding? I can only give my understanding, and of course I'm allowed to be wrong. But I said, there's nothing here. This was just like a classic example of making factual statements that would refute statements that don't exist. They were really banging on a lot of, whether Pavel says it or I say it or other people say it, anti-glycolytic training and is not this, it's not good, it's bad, it's all this nonsense. One of the things that he started with, like, I disagree with anti-glycolytic training. And I'm like, well, listen, and this is part of my text exchange with my guy in Australia. I'm like, if you disagree with anti-glycolytic training, that means you're basically saying that the research was wrong. Like, people flubbed the data. There's accusations that even the mighty Carmelo Bosco used to flub data a little bit. Whether they did or not is not the point. The point is that if you're saying you disagree with anti-glycolytic training as a concept, that means someone is going to perform protocols that would fall into whatever the category is of anti-glycolytic training, and then it's not actually happening. So if I were to do 5 kettlebell swings every 60 seconds, and I say that's anti-glycolytic training, then you're saying you disagree with that, then you're saying that I did use glycolytic systems. And this is absolutely ludicrous. The whole podcast was based on assumptions that were not being suggested, not being made. And then to bang on somebody that for things that, like, milk doesn't cure cancer, like that's the level of foolishness that these folks are talking about. And that happens a lot. That happens, I think a lot of that is things that I feel strongly about, like the FMS, where, well, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do this, except that's not what it's supposed to do. So you're actually saying a lot of factual things that would be correct within its own microcosmic context, but it's not what the commercial model or even what the science is saying. So it's not that, well, it doesn't do this. Well, you could say that about anything. The camera that I'm talking to doesn't turn the lights on in this room. Like, that's a factual statement, but one that was never made. And I'm using like these wild, sensational examples. I listen to the whole thing because I'm going back to, if somebody asks me to do something and I can do it, I also must show enough humility that maybe there would be something in there that can make me better. But even if there isn't, I know that I can continue to reject certain concepts. So let's talk a little bit anti-glycolytic training as a concept, which is significantly researched, is, can you perform in a glycolytic environment, which we know is very, very costly, which is going to require forms of recovery. You can only do it for so long. You can only do it for so many repetitions. You can only do it for so many repeats. Can you excel at those types of tests and performance environments by either never or minimally getting into those energy systems in totality? So If I want to do 100 snatches as fast as I can, I want to do the strong first kettlebell snatch test, and whatever the standards are, I can put it down, I can change hands once, whatever. The old school, you couldn't, I'm pretty sure you couldn't even put it down. You're only allowed to switch hands once. Now you can put it down and do whatever you want. My best official snatch test, I'm pretty sure, let me get this right, I did it in 3:49. It was, and that doesn't suck because 24 kilo for me at that time isn't very heavy, even with these junky shoulders. Did I ever do 5 minutes straight? No, never. I don't think most people don't. Of course, you're going to test yourself to, we call them time trials. That's what Fridays at MARSOC, 2nd Battalion, we did Fridays, which was like time trials, where we just did things, and you had the weekend to recover. So can you chunk the unique physiology of that snatch test, which is significantly glycolytic, doing something very, very heavy for most people, doing it really, really fast for a relatively long period of time, that's going to be glycolytic. But if you do 5 snatches on one arm, and then rest to 30 seconds, and then do 5 seconds on the other arm, and you don't do it for 5 minutes, but you do it for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, where you never really get overly fatigued, but every snatch is high quality repetition. Every snatch is going to be performed with almost your gas tank refueled each time. There's something, and why the research is done and what it shows is that even though you never go for 5 minutes, you will be able to go for 5 minutes. The very non-scientific approach is the WTH effect, what the hell effect, also known as the WTF. We won't say the word. Like, how did that happen? Well, that's what we can learn from this anti-glycolytic approach. And we just use the kettlebell snatches because this podcast that my guy asked me to listen to, it was clearly talking about Pavel, even though they didn't name his name, which I thought was really soft. My content right now is not about banging on this guy. It's banging on an entire process, but also somebody that asked me to do something and understand some science and understand that, if your content is always about somebody else's content, how about tell me what you do? Tell me what you came up with. What did you innovate? Rather than why everybody else is just wrong. And that sucks. Even if they're correct, even if they're right, but if your whole basis is just about showing what other people do wrong, it's scraping on the chalkboard after a while. Part of the component is that if you can do repeat explosive efforts at this lower volume, meaning you don't build up as much of those glycolytic costs, those glycolytic byproducts. Part of what they were talking about in this podcast, again, accurately renouncing the viability of lactic acid. I'm going to go so far to say lactic acid is made up. Now, I like to talk in sensational things. Lactic acid is not a real thing. It's not something that you can measure. It doesn't exist. What I think exists is lactate, and very, very useful tool. Lactate is really, really good, okay? They were saying this on the podcast. If somebody is saying lactate is bad, well, then they don't understand physiology, and they should be coached up. Lactate goes back into the Krebs cycle and can be part of continued generation of energy. Now, what lactic acid would come about in a theoretical make-believe world, that when lactate is high, you also have a high concentration of hydrogen ions, which then will have this one way of then changing blood acidity. I'm not sure we're gonna dispute that. Like I only listened once, but the conclusion of the researcher, which ironically was also from Australia, was that it's the hydrogen ions that create changes in muscle function, not just the acidosis. But you can't really dissociate it. I think they were banging on the message that acidosis is bad. Again, nobody said this. What we're saying, or at least what I would say in my understanding of physiology, is that under conditions of acidosis, in this case from increased hydrogen ions, because lots of other things can create acidosis, muscles don't shut off, but they become more difficult to create maximal contractions. That happens. I believe that happens. We can look that up in the literature, and it would probably fall under neuromuscular fatigue. Okay. Next, precision will change. Accuracy changes. Under the conditions of acidosis, spontaneous electrical activity in the contractile elements of the muscle begin to become more predominant. Basically, there's little baby spasms. And those motor contractions, I don't think you can have a contraction without motor, but those contractions then start to infiltrate the strategy of your motor skill, meaning you're doing something new or different, and your accuracy may no longer be ideal. The whole idea of under-recovered environments being useful for motor skill acquisition is this. Good athletes will get the ball in the basket. Good athletes will put the ball into the hole under horribly under-recovered positions because that's what makes them really, really good athletes. And when they are training their skills under high concentration of hydrogen ions / acidosis, they can still contract. The muscles don't shut off. No one said this, even though that's what they were saying on the podcast. But from an accuracy standpoint, when you start to get really, really good at this unpredictable environment, I put that into the category or the description of you're getting really, really good at walking on a balance beam, or you're getting really, really good at walking on a tightrope, because that's what good athletes will figure it out. This whole idea is that we need to shoot free throws when you're fatigued, to me, is inconsistent with the laws of physiology. The way you get good at shooting free throws under fatigue is don't get fatigued. And that you don't practice under fatigue, you practice when you're not fatigued. Because practicing walking on a tightrope doesn't help you walking on solid ground. That's how I look at this, of why this topic, which was not really what was being discussed. They were just saying that acidosis doesn't do this, but nobody says it doesn't do it. I'm giving you some context of why I think acidosis and this increase of hydrogen ions from foolish training is a reason for trouble. Learning to walk on a tightrope doesn't help you walk, meaning you're learning a motor strategy under certain conditions that does not carry over to when you're not fatigued, aka when you're ready for competition. That's why I use two examples in basketball and in golf where we're really not better at those skills because I don't think we practice them under the most ideal conditions. Sprinters, shot putters, high jumpers, they're all better because they take significant rest in between their expressions of their skills. There's a third thing that I think happens under these glycolytic conditions as to why we should be training anti-glycolytic. When acidity builds and those spontaneous electrical activity moments continue, after a while your body adapts. And your body's like, hey, you know what? To hell with this. I don't want to continue to have to create this muscle contraction. So we're going to figure out a way to just leave it contracted and leave it tense. I think there's an interaction because as ATP is being broken down to ADP and a phosphate group, the phosphate group, which again was talked about on the podcast, it gets in the way of the calcium getting in and out of the cell. That's why we have our sarcoplasmic hypertrophy protocols for deposition and biogenesis of mitochondria in the sarcoplasm. Why do you want it there? More mitochondria means more calcium that can get in. When you're fatigued and acidosis is not allowing the mitochondria to work functionally, that's probably a tough statement. My buddy Chris Frankel will get mad at me. Under acidosis, mitochondria don't work as well. We're going to say that. So now the phosphagen minimizes the calcium getting into the cell. So physiology lesson, okay? This is all what I think is happening. I think I'm correct. I'm using words that are very, very global, so cuff me if there's a more precise scientific description. This is how I look at it. When calcium doesn't get in and out of the cell, there's this form of microtetany, aka what I would describe as the energy crisis theory, where now the muscle becomes contracted because there's no more oxygen when the mitochondria can't build ATP through these oxygen pathways because you're always training predominantly without oxygen. Now the muscle has a tender point, the muscle becomes stiffer. If you let this go forever, fibrosis can happen, at which point it's very, very difficult to change the tissue. So those are the three reasons why we should even be interested in glycolytic training. Because the evidence would suggest, I'll take it back, you can still win your 5-minute snatch test by doing very, very small bouts of sprinting Sometimes you're not even using as heavy of a load as you're going to use in your snatch test, because you don't build up these cascades that lead to decreased muscle function, that lead to changes in skill, and lead to changes in the tissue in that sequence. Those are all things that happen. And does that always happen under all different forms of acidosis? I think yes. But from a training aspect, it's from hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions is what's linked to the acidosis. Because what they were describing is so weird. If this is weird to you, then we're on the same page. If acidosis can be accumulated and measured from things other than training, then it's not the acidosis at fault from glycolytic training. I'm like, oh my God, but it's still, but then it's the hydrogen. So like the goofy podcaster said that, he said, okay, so it's the hydrogen ions, not the acidosis per se. And the guy said yes. So he's like, it's kind of, he would always draw back, like a real scientist would say, it's all one and the same for our purposes of why we should want to train this way. So I think that's important to appreciate. Now, let's take this another step. Glycolytic training is not the only way to train, number one. Number two, I would reserve glycolytic training to certain phases of a training protocol or a yearly cycle. Part of the trade-off for staying highly ready and highly recovered at all times is that you probably aren't going to develop more strength, more power, okay? Because you know why? You need acidosis to do that. So glycolytic training that minimizes acidosis is not the only way to train. What's crucial is to understand such thing, acidosis, edema, hypoxia, all these things. That's why in EPP you hear me say, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. You need those things, and then you need to recover for things such as hypertrophy of endocrine glands. Bigger glands, bigger balls are going to spit out more stuff. And that is crucial. And we need acidosis to trigger those responses as far as I'm concerned. So then we will choose highly glycolytic training models to develop those things. And when you find the type of trainee or athlete that I'm describing, and they're doing significant glycolytic tests, such as a 400-meter run, they're going to have high levels of lactate because they're really, really good at then buffering the acidosis, and then the lactate allows them to continue to run. High levels of lactate in highly explosive athletes is really good. It's really desirable, especially if they can maintain being explosive, because that means they're very, very good at buffering the acidosis and or carbon dioxide if we take a more respiratory view of this. I think hydrogen ions, acidosis, and CO2 are kind of cousins, if not, inbred cousins. They're all relatively similar. Lactate is not part of this. Like, that's a different thing. So when we say, no one's saying lactate is bad. That's really what was frustrating from hey, I'm not banging on the podcast. I listened to the whole thing. I did what they wanted me to do. But to be able to have a good discussion, yeah, probably some confirmational bias. Cuff me again, because I'm always going to tell you my own biases. The real questions were, hey, was there anything new here? And I said, no, like what the scientists were saying, it was just janky and jerky and prickly on how they surrounded everything. And I would get probably a lot more disappointed when I hear these things about FMS, because, again, when people will say same thing, the FMS doesn't predict it. Okay, well, it's not supposed to. I don't care what the marketing stuff said in 2002 or whatever. So if you say those things, like, okay, you're saying a true thing, but it is not attached to the commercial claims, or in this case, anti-glycolytic training, what the evidence is suggesting. So no, it's not the only way to train, but it does deliver some very, very significant value. And the scientist was properly explaining the physiology, but his responses were to lines of question and maybe a tone that people were claiming things that weren't exactly true. Here's one that was really wild, that acidosis causes rhabdo. I'm like, I just told my guy in our DMs, I was like, yeah, I've never heard of that. I'd have to actually look it up. I'm more in line that rhabdo as a hypernephrotic process, something in the kidneys is breaking down muscle, and those are some significant byproducts, but it typically happens under significant thermal conditions, increased temperature. So our big enemies are typically acidosis, hypoxia, and significant thermal changes. So I'm like, I never heard anybody say, not just because I didn't hear it, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But again, the commentary was being phrased and positioned that training glycolytic, that you become super overtrained and get your ass kicked, and then you get rhabdo. That's not how it works. Like that's just weird. I'm bringing these things to light because number one, I think there's some easy lessons. I'd like to think I've said them before. I'd like to see that if you had T equals R EPP, you've heard me say these things. But remember, that's still a while ago, and I always look at the stuff that I've put out there. Man, like I would say it differently today. So I'll keep saying it, especially if it's situations like this, where we were talking yesterday with Jesse Olinger, and like one of the things that's a really important thing to do on social media to turn over and meet your goals. I got to give you free shit. So listen, it's all free. I still like you to buy EPP. Do me a favor. But guys, the piece of a message, like if we're gonna challenge something and make a claim, well then that claim should actually have validity. Validity means it does what it says it's doing. If something's not valid, it doesn't do what it says it's doing. So your claim, like if I say you're a bad person, I have to have validity to that because I need to then potentially defend my statement. There's no defense for something that has no validity. That's why it's a scientific word. Like the research doesn't support, so you can't even defend that type of claim or that type of statement. So if I had to summarize, number one, if somebody asks you to do something at all costs, I think it's a good thing to do. I think it's good. As an adjunct to that, I am very excited sometimes to engage in some type of information accumulation, not learning, information accumulation that may challenge what I think. And there was nothing in this that it was actually all confirmational bias. It was terribly annoying, but it was all the same things that I would believe. Number two, I think content should be yours. What makes you different? What makes you special? Business rule number two, you have to be different. Nobody said you had to be good at what you do. Golly, lots of people make a lot of money by not being good, but they're different. So if you're just talking about somebody else, you're not different. I think we should be different. And so I try very hard. And if somebody were to say I'm being hypocrite, I'm just using this topic to bring out that number two. Because this is about a conversation that I had with somebody on DM, not that I found a podcast that I found distasteful. And then number three, these tenets of anti-glycolytic training and where I've learned it. Again, all that stuff is on EPP, but anti-glycolytic training, you will be leaving things on the table. So it's not that acidosis or hydrogen ions or hypoxia or even increased tissue temperatures, all of these things can be good and not good. And all of these drivers that we think are drivers of critical adaptations, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. We have to toggle all of these things. But to suggest that anti-glycolytic training is bad or dumb or not effective, that's wild. That's just silly. But it really falls into this category, which I have said for a very, very long time, is if you want to get noticed, then you got two ways to do it nowadays. Way back when there wasn't 9 million people on social media, you could kind of say good things and people had resonance. But now you got two ways to do it. One, just talk about the research, because the research is univariant and unilateral. It's this. But training and life is all like this. So you can't research certain things. Number two, just say the opposite of what somebody really popular was saying. And you got me to listen. And I don't think they were banging on me. I bet these people wouldn't know me if they ran me over with their truck. But they were talking about Pavel. And I do believe that. And it was kind of lame, too, where they don't name the name. If you are going to go down that road, I would rather talk about concepts without naming a name, so at least we can talk about a concept. I don't even know the name of this podcaster, so you can't hold me on that. Anyway, anti-glycolytic training, or whatever else we're going to call it, really, really very, very, very useful. Not the only way to train. Certainly leaving some adaptations on the table. But acidosis, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. And oh, by the way, acidosis doesn't cause rhabdosis.